This is what I'm going to discuss now. I'll be discussing the payment identification, then the payment type information, currency and amount elements, and the charge bearer elements is what we will be now talking about. So let's start with the payment identification method. Now, when we speak about payment identification, let us first understand another concept. There are two kinds of identifications used, even in the empty category of messages. One is called the point-to-point identification, and the second is called the end-to-end identification. To take an example, there could be banks like, let's say, Bank 1, then Bank 2, Bank 3. Let me shift them a little. And Bank 4. These are the 4 banks in a payment transaction. Bank 1 can create a message, send it to Bank 2. Bank 2 can create a message, send it to Bank 3. Bank 3 creates a message, sends that to Bank 4. Now, when Bank 1 creates a message, had it been an empty message, in field 20, I would have added something like, let's say, A123 as the identifier. This is the identifier which is point to point, from point Bank 1 to point Bank 2. This identifier is going to be used. When Bank 2 creates the field 20 in an MT103 message, it may say X999 and then send it over from point Bank 2 to point Bank 3. And similarly, when Bank 3 creates the third MT103, it may again in that field 20 add an identification like, let's say, H345 and send it onwards here. So these are our point-to-point identifiers. In MX also, and in CBPR Plus also, I'll be having my point-to-point identifiers. I also have in SWIFT MT an end-to-end identifier, and UETR, unique end-to-end transaction reference number, is the only end-to-end identifier which you use currently in your MT category. So this is what I would call as end-to-end identifier, and these are all our, in yellow, point-to-point identifiers. This is the way in which we have got different identifiers created. Now, when it comes to MT, only 2 identifiers are there. One is end-to-end, UETR. Second is field 20, point-to-point. When it comes to MX, ISO MX CBPR Plus, I got one end-to-end, one point-to-point identifier, and that is instruction identification. Instruction identification is a point-to-point reference in similar to MT field 20 in my MX messages. When it comes to CBPR Plus, it is mandatory to have the point-to-point identification in your PAC 008. But when it comes to end-to-end identification, in MT, I had only UETR as the end-to-end identifier. Here, I got 3 end-to-end identifiers. First one is end-to-end identification. Second is transaction identification. The third is UETR. What we need to look at is who creates that identifier and who consumes that identifier. This is the key point of difference between those 3 end-to-end identifiers. So let's start with the first identifier, which is the end-to-end identification. The end-to-end identification is to be provided by the debtor. In my example on the Excel sheet, it is to be provided by fiat. And it has to be carried unchanged throughout the payment process till it reaches Honda, the beneficiary, that is the creditor. So the first identification is created by the debtor to be consumed by the creditor. So creator is the debtor fiat, consumer is the creditor, which is Honda. In CBPR Plus, this is mandatory. If fiat, the debtor, does not provide this end-to-end identification, then the debtor agent, that is in our example, Bank of America, should populate that element by saying it is not provided by debtor fiat to take care of the mandatory element. Now, why is this needed? It is created by fiat and to be given to Honda for reconciliation purposes. Honda must understand, because fiat is going to independently communicate with Honda and tell Honda that for this transaction, I have made this payment. So fiat creates the end-to-end identifier to be given to Honda so that the reconciliation process can happen between Honda and fiat. The next identifier is the transaction identification. This is optional in CBPR Plus. This is assigned by the first instructing agent. That is in our example, it is to be assigned by Bank of America. It can be consumed by anybody and it is used to identify the transactions. This is the second type. The third is the unique end-to-end transaction reference number. UATR is to be assigned either by fiat or by Bank of America, the first agent, and it is to be used for tracking in the GPI process of SWIFT. So in CBPR Plus, this is a mandatory element. So we have got these three end-to-end identifiers in my MX and also in CBPR Plus. In MT, I have got only one, the last one, which is UATR. So these are our identifiers in my PAX08. In addition to this, when the clearing system processes a transaction, the clearing system may also add its own identifier. It's a point-to-point identifier assigned by the market infrastructure. In my earlier example, there was this CHAPS UK. Let me go there. CHAPS UK processing the transaction. CHAPS UK will add a point-to-point identifier to identify that particular transaction. So these are the identifiers which you have in the PAX 008.